Today we're going to be talking about resource partitioning. And resource partitioning, as we're going to get into, is really just kind of the divvying up of resources in an environment or in an ecosystem. Remember, in any ecosystem, there are finite amounts of most resources. So space, food, water, shelter, sunlight, all of these things we have to have enough to go around, right? So in any given ecosystem, species are going to fight over these different resources because without these resources, they can't survive. So there's going to be lots of competition among these resources. Who gets to live in this part of the ecosystem? Maybe it has the best defense against predators, and who has this hunting ground, or who has this area to forage. So there's going to be interspecies competition. There's going to be intraspecies competition where members of the same species are going to be competing with one another. But again, it's all because these resources are finite. They are not just in unlimited supply. Even sunlight, which you may think that sunlight is, well, sunlight, there's plenty of sunlight to go around. But in a dense forest where there's only a certain amount of light getting through the canopy, like in the tropical rainforest, light is definitely a finite resource. So the plants there really have to compete with who's getting the light and who's getting to the light first, because if you get above a certain plant and you're below it and the light's blocked, then you're out of luck. So competition between and among these resources is really fierce, and it's really what drives natural selection, right? Organisms are going to try to be as well adapted as they possibly can to get those resources. And if they simply cannot compete with the other members of the species or with other species, then that organism is probably going to be driven to extinction, right? The species, if it can't compete, it's either going to have to change the way it does things, or it's going to face extinction because it can't simply just be outcompeted every day and continue to survive. So what we're doing with this, like I mentioned before, with resource partitioning is organisms are going to be kind of dividing up the different resources to allow less competition, and therefore more organisms are going to survive because of it. And ultimately, it's not like all the organisms in an area get together and have a meeting or a council and say, you get this and you get that. It's just one of those things where organisms kind of find their niche, they find their role, and really if they're all working together, it's going to make the entire ecosystem more stable. And when it's more stable, then you have more members there, and you have kind of healthy lines of competition, and it's kind of a win-win situation for everybody. So the species are going to divide up how these resources are used. When they're used can be a big difference, right? So if everybody's not using the same resources at the same time, then that can help divide things up. For example, some organisms decide to be nocturnal, and that's probably a result of if they weren't as competitive as other species. If they can become nocturnal, then you have a lot of animals that are asleep, and so you kind of have the run of the place at night. So we have a lot of nocturnal animals who probably became that way to avoid competition, right? You've got everybody active during the day, you sleep during the day, come out at night, and whatever you need is right there for you. So competition is going to be very, very low, except in certain ecosystems where most of your organisms are nocturnal. So that, like thinking like a desert, right? It's very hot during the day, not a lot of activity. A lot of your organisms are nocturnal simply because it's too hot to come out during the day. But we have a lot of, nocturnal animals that live in forest areas and things like that, simply because there's just too much competition at night. If you think of an owl, right? An owl is a nocturnal animal, doesn't have to compete with other predatory birds during the day, so it's a nocturnal animal, does very well at night, it's very successful, and it reduces the competition between those predatory birds, so that's a good thing for everybody. So there's lots of different ways that resources can be divided up, not just by timing. The amount that is being used by each species can be limited. So for example, some species, they may not just be able to gorge themselves as much as they want to because another group, let's say it's a tree, it's a fig tree, right? And there's only so many figs that grow on that tree. Some organisms may come and feed, and then they may be run off by a larger species. That's kind of resource partitioning. The larger species may allow the organisms to eat for a while, and then they may run them off, and then they go and feed. sectioning the area that's being used. So whether that's a tree or whether that's a body of water, what we're talking about there is, like, let's say we have a lot of birds that are living in a tree, and this is probably one of the more classic examples, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. But when you have a tree and you have birds living in that tree, some birds may live at the bottom of the tree. Some birds may live, in the middle of the tree towards the trunk. Some may live on the outermost branches, and some may live in the top part of the tree. And they all use different parts of that tree. They may forage in different areas. They may raise their young in different ways, right? Some may put their nest really close to the trunk. Some may put their nest really far out. So even though it's one tree, what we're really trying to do with this resource partitioning is not step on one another's toes. So the birds are all living there, they're all coexisting peacefully, and they're allowed to do that because they're divvying up how these resources are being used when they're being used. So another way that we can divide up these resources is split the different types of resource between each species. So, if you have a situation where water is at a premium and there's not a whole lot of water to go around, organisms are going to share that water, right? Like if you think about a watering hole where you have a lot of different species coming together, and maybe species, you've got a lion here and you've got a zebra here, and they're, mortal enemies, but they're going to, when they're at that watering hole, hey, everybody's getting some water. We all got to have water to survive, and so it's not going to be a place where there's going to be a lot of, hunting and that sort of thing, because everyone kind of realizes that, we've all got to coexist. If the lions are going to continue to have food, they can't kill a zebra every time they come to the water hole. So divvying things up that way. Resource partitioning simply allows for more species to coexist and have a lot less loss through the action of competition, right? Competition is greatly reduced in these areas where the resources are being divided up. And so again, it's better for everybody. The species essentially live around each other without a lot of overlap. So, like I said, as long as they're not stepping on one another's toes and there's plenty to go around, if people aren't starving, or if the organisms aren't starving to death, and they're not, without shelter, if everybody's got shelter and everybody's got food and everybody's got water, then everybody's pretty happy, pretty content, and you can have a nice, stable environment there. Some species can evolve to have difference in necessities to compensate for the resource partitioning. So some organisms may actually evolve to survive off of less. If they're not one of the more competitive species, what we see is sometimes their requirements are reduced, and so that may mean you see a size difference in those species. What once may have been a larger species of bird, for example, is now a smaller species due to the fact that they couldn't compete with a larger species, so they became a smaller species because those individuals, they don't need as much food, and so they do a lot better of environments where just a little bit of food each day can sustain them. So resource partitioning can really drive evolution, right? So like I just said, the bird getting smaller there. Some organisms, the way that they obtain food, right, that may drive their evolution. So they may, evolve from an organism that is a, fierce hunter or fierce predator, and they may simply have to evolve into more of a scavenger role. Right? Because if you're not as large as the large predators, and the predators are taking down big prey, and you can't compete with them, then you may find yourself in a scavenger role. There's lots of leftovers out there, right? And so scavengers do really well within that role. Hyenas, vultures, all those types of organisms, they're scavengers, but they do incredibly well in most situations. Species can become very specialized for obtaining a certain type of food. Maybe they're the only organisms that can obtain a certain type of food, whether that's cracking open a seed, whether that's being able to eat something that no one else can eat, like a sea urchin or something along those lines, something that's very protected, or maybe something that's toxic. If you can eat something that's toxic to other species, then you kind of have the monopoly on that particular food source. We already mentioned being nocturnal and how that can help divvy things up. and then living in different but similar areas. So same habitat, different niche, right? What is your role within that environment? That's your niche. So even though they may live in the exact same habitat, right? They're all living in a forest together. One may live in a tree, one may live underground, one may forage for bugs in trees, one may forage for bugs, growing on plants, or they're going to feed on pollinators, or whatever the case may be. They just divvy up those resources so that everybody is allowed to live in that habitat and reduce as much competition as possible. Each organism is going to evolve to be the best possible fit for that niche. And that's really what we're looking at when we look at ecosystems. Is in most stable ecosystems, you have organisms that are very well suited to their role. And so as long as everybody's working within their role, then you have a very stable environment. So what I mentioned before, probably the most classic example of this, are a group of birds called the warblers. The warblers live in trees, and they're the ones who really, kind of when we first started studying this and kind of first figured out what was going on, they're the ones that were living at the bottom of the tree, the inside of the tree, the outside of the tree, the middle of the tree, the top of the tree. And scientists really said, look, this is how organisms are coexisting. This is how they are all able to live here. It's because they have differences in how they forage, they have differences where they live in the tree, even the timing of their reproduction, right? They would stagger their reproduction periods so that not all the baby birds are in the tree at the same time. So some are born earlier than others, some are born later, and so they kind of stagger those births so that they're not directly, competing with one another to build the nest and to provide food for the young. So no matter how we do it or how the organisms do it, resource partitioning is absolutely essential in maintaining healthy, stable ecosystems. I'll see you next time.